Doing this podcast makes me respect the evolution of law. I've read old stories where they convicted a guy for murder. All he was doing was riding the dead guy's horse or wearing the dead guy's clothes. And that's the only evidence they had against him. And they hung him.
Robert Petersen was born in Bakersfield, but he was raised all over the world. He lived in Tripoli, Libya, Dubai, Jakarta, Indonesia. He's worked in retail and sales in the past. And in the early COVID days, he passed his time by reading archived newspapers from the Bakersfield Californian. And that's how Notorious Bakersfield was born. In today's show, we're discussing crime in Bakersfield, and not your average crime that happens recently that we can all go to the search engine and find. Robert Petersen, that runs NotoriousBakersfield.com, he goes a little bit deeper. He runs across stuff in old newspaper archives and then just kind of goes down that rabbit hole to learn more about these crimes. And so he's going to be covering two ferries, which took place in 1926, Rampage in Rosedale, and Abandon on the Freeway. So you want to check this stuff out, and we're going to be covering a lot of stuff, and we actually have a co-host with us today who's also a big fan of Robert, so it's good to kind of get her take on this stuff. So, and then we're also going to be talking about the rapid fire questions that we asked him, his best advice, if he won $10 million, what he would do with it, and a common myth about his job or expertise. And the other one is we asked him about his music preferences. So stay tuned and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Our 2 Cents Podcast, the show where your local professionals sit down with an array of guests to hear their story and impart some wisdom for both business and life-improving skills. This is your place to hear business and community leaders discuss relevant topics that matter to you.
Okay, welcome to Our 2 Cents Podcast. I'm your host today, Dave Plivelich, and I've got co-host here, Kyle Jones, and I know she doesn't want to talk, but she's going to be a co-host anyways, and talk Jamie Urner with Kern Fiduciary Services, so she's a fiduciary. So welcome, everybody, and we're interviewing Robert Petersen, and we're going to get to who you are and what you do here in a second. So welcome, Kyle. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, bud. How are you?
Nervous.
No, I'm good. Sound good.
It's all good.
This is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, this is going to be great because, I'd never heard of Robert before, and he's got Notorious Bakersfield Podcast. And so Jamie I was talking to, and I mentioned it, she goes, oh my God, I listened to his podcast. I'm like, well, guess what you're going to get to do? So we brought her in to co-host on this one. So that being said, tell us a little bit about yourself, Robert.
I'm a Bakersfield native. I was born here. I was raised all over. I'm an oil brat. Grew up overseas, Tripoli, Libya, Jakarta, Indonesia, and Dubai, the United Arab Emirates. Came back to the States the last 2 years of high school, and I graduated from Highland High School. So I'm a Bakersfield native.
So what do you do besides the podcast? Is
the podcast.
That's it? Awesome. That's awesome.
So you're all in.
I'm not making money on it.
Yeah, but that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I'm retired. I'll say that.
All right. With a cool podcast, apparently. So how did you go about getting into this particular subject?
At the beginning of COVID lockdowns, when everybody was watching the Tiger King and
all the Netflix specials.
Yeah.
I started reading. I wanted to see how Bakersfield responded to the Spanish flu pandemic. And so I started reading old newspaper articles. And I'm like, hey, these are some fascinating stories that I had never heard of. Yeah. And I'm like, somebody needs to retell these stories. And so that's how I got started. And that was June 1st. I launched June 1st of 2021.
Oh, wow. So, any experience prior to that? I mean, just like, all right, I'm going to get a microphone and start talking.
None in journalism or anything. I thought about doing a blog, but I'm not a very good writer, and I was worried about people critiquing my grammar. And so I thought, you know what, I can tell a story. So That's how I started. That's why I chose a podcast.
Yeah. It seems like there's a lot of things that have come out positively from the COVID days. You know what I mean?
Negative and positive. Yeah. So I want to, I know we're going to get into the podcast itself, but you said something that struck a chord with me, is that you did some research on how Bakersfield reacted to the Spanish flu. Were you able to find a lot of articles on that? And
quite a few, yeah. They closed school.
Okay.
They closed school down during the Spanish flu and had face coverings and stuff like that.
Did it seem to be as politically charged?
No.
Okay.
There were, I guess I don't know if you call it politically charged, but they would arrest people like in San Francisco for not wearing face coverings.
Really?
Yeah. I don't think it was like a political thing, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, obviously with how charged it is right now, mm-hmm. You can't have a debate or you can't have an agreement on anything with COVID. Face covering, vaccines, school closures, mandates. You're either on one side or the other. There's no, common ground. So I was curious to see if that was kind of the case then.
But in Bakersfield, they did close schools down.
They did.
Yeah.
Wow. For how long?
I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So we've been through this before and just handled it differently.
A little differently. Yeah.
Very cool. So you started the podcast. What are some of your most interesting stories that I'm sure you get asked that a lot.
The most satisfying one for me, I deal with a lot of dark subjects. It's not totally true crime. It's not totally murder, but it is heavy on that. But one of the most satisfying episodes I did was the abandoned on the freeway, the little girl that was abandoned on the freeway. And in 1969, she was 5-year-old girl was abandoned on the freeway south of Bakersfield. Her parents abandoned her and nobody knew who she was. And they finally found her parents, her mom and stepdad. And come to find out that the stepdad murdered her older brother, and a couple of years prior to that. But anyways, I found out about the story through Kern County of Old on Facebook, and people were talking about it and whatever happened to that girl. And so I did the story on it, and then I thought, I'm going to try and find her, and I found her.
Oh, wow.
I was able to interview her, and people were wondering, how's she doing, what's she like? Well, little Jody is now Grandma Jody, mm-hmm. and she's alive and well and has raised a family on her own. So
that's cool. Is she in Bakersfield?
No. But she does have a brother that lives here. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. So you use Facebook group to some of your things, or where do you do your research or hear about some of these?
I have people suggest stories. Most of them I've heard about. Most of the stories that I like, that I enjoy, are stories that are hard to find, information on. People are always talking about the Vincent Brothers murders. And that's, for some reason, that just doesn't really, because you can click the internet and you can have all the information you want about it, because it happened in the internet age. I like the older stories that weren't around during the internet.
So you get to do a little bit digger deep.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you like to do the research to kind of complete
like
the story.
The stories. Yeah.
I wanted to bring this up at some point, but so I have an interesting, I don't know if you've heard of this or not a fun subject, but my great grandparents were murdered in Bakersfield.
Oh, wow.
In the 80s. It was a home invasion gone wrong, and my great-grandfather was shot and killed, and my great-grandmother was basically bound in a closet and left just to die. So I vaguely knew about it. It happened. I remember coming from school. My mom was crying, and I think I was like 5 at the time, maybe 6, and they just basically said your great-grandparents have died, but I didn't know the story, right? You're not going to tell a 5-year-old what happened. So for most of my childhood, I just knew that they had died. And then there was a episode that came on. I don't know if it was not Unsolved Mysteries or True Crime. It was some television show that came on, and I'm sitting there, and they're interviewing my grandma's brother and all these people, and I'm like, what's going on in here? And then I finally learned the story, and I guess the case was solved decades later through this new technology. I think it was a detective, but they developed some way to match the bullet, and they were able to track it to a gun that the perpetrator sold to a pawn shop in Bakersfield some 20 years later, and they ended up convicting him a couple decades later. So
what were the names?
Merck was the last name.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with that one or if you researched it or not.
Yeah, I have.
But anyway.
In fact, the guy altered the barrel of the gun.
Yes. And I think that's how they were able to pin him on it later on.
Have you done a podcast on that one yet?
Not yet.
So I would love to be, you said you get suggestions from your listeners. So there's one if you want to dig into it a little bit.
I've looked into it.
Yeah. I'd be interested I'm sure there's a lot I don't know about.
So how would you feel about it if I'm interviewing you.
Yeah, wait a second.
That's what podcasters do, right? We can't help it.
I've contacted the survivors of crimes.
Okay.
And they've been like the children of. And they've been hesitant, or not hesitant, they've refused to be interviewed, which I understand. I can kind of understand it. How would you feel about it?
I wouldn't mind, personally. I can't speak for my mom or other family members that are still alive. You know, I could definitely ask them if you're interested.
I'm just curious, like a psychological thing, because I can understand there's no way that anybody that hasn't gone through that could wrap their head around what they experienced.
Well, I was so young, right?
Yeah.
And so the truth of it didn't come out until I was significantly older. I just had thought always, like I said, that my great-grandparents had died, right? Which that's what great-grandparents do, right? You know, so it wasn't until later that I actually learned about what happened. And so the last podcast we did where Troy was interviewing me, you know, the kind of series we did, we're talking about one of the judges that I grew up with, his son, and that's why I was influenced to become an attorney. He was actually the judge assigned to the case and had to recuse himself because when he realized the connection, he knew the family. So small world.
Yeah, it is.
So to answer to your question, yes, I'd speak with you.
I just curious, you know, because the one kid asked me not to do it. He said, you know, not only will I not be interviewed for it, but I'd ask you not to do the story.
Oh.
I haven't done it yet.
Okay. That's tough because, I mean, it is.
It happened in their home.
Right.
In one of the cases, the kids were there. Their mom and dad and grandmother were murdered right in the house that they were sleeping in. It's just a terrible thing that they went through and that they're still living with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a dark subject, like you said. A lot of them are dark subjects, but they're fascinating, you know, because it's human nature. I mean, I think we all are kind of.
I think it's the randomness that gets our curiosity. That somebody can be in their house minding their own business, doing nothing, and then somebody comes in, intrudes. So.
Yeah, that's a little different. I don't know about you guys, but if you hear a story of a spouse killing another spouse in a heated argument or something, it's like, okay, well, not that it's not tragic and sad, but it's just like it makes sense a little bit. You can understand, like, you know, there's an infidelity involved, or people just saw red for a minute and something happened, right? And so you can kind of almost wrap your head around that. But my point is like the randomness of certain crimes that just kind of make us like, well, how could you do that, or why would someone do that, or you know. I mean, with my great-grandparents is a good example. I mean, a home invasion, a couple in their 80s on the east side of town, just enjoying telling their life. Like, how could you? Yeah. That's what makes those interesting.
That happens quite often.
I know.
It's a sad thing. You know? The parrots that were over by Centennial Park just a few years ago, well, probably like 10 years ago now. So,
but stuff like that, you're not looking into as much because it's new, and like you said, you can find information on it pretty readily. Yeah. I'm
just listening. I'm like, wow, this is so
you never
cool.
knew this about Kyle.
I did not.
That's not something normally comes up in conversation.
No, it doesn't. That doesn't. So how many podcasts have you done to date?
44.
44, and you try to do them once a month, once a week.
I started out doing them every other week, and then I thought, you know what, I'll try it, give a hand, do it at once a week, and if it turns into a job, then I'll scale back. But so far, staying at once a week.
And why are they so short?
By design. When I started out, I became a quick study on podcasts, and I learned that people who listen to podcasts are doing other activities. They're doing household chores or exercising, but the number one thing that people are doing when they're listening to podcasts is commuting to and from work or school. And I looked at the commute time in Bakersfield, and it's between 10 and 20 minutes. And so that's why I kind of wanted to keep them at that. And I'm not doing a deep dive. Like, I'm not going to solve some unsolved murder from 20 years ago, you know. I'm just kind of giving the basic facts of the case. So
you do a really good job. Do you have any interest in doing more of like an episodic series on one story?
Different one? Yeah.
You mean like a 4-part, like one story and make it a 10 or 10-minute episode? Yeah.
Because some of them I feel like you could go a little deeper, and it's only a 12 or 15-minute episode, which to your point with the commute, that makes sense. But sometimes for the listener, I wish you'd go into all the dirty details and spend a little bit more time on it. So are you considering something a little
There's
longer?
A couple stories that are really complex. Recently, the DeStefani fire that happened a few weeks ago, Bill DeStefani's uncle was murdered in the 80s. And come to find out, he was murdered by an organized crime ring in Bakersfield, where the leader was a reserve Bakersfield police officer.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah. And they were responsible for 3 other murders. dozens of robberies and burglaries and attempted robberies and attempted kidnappings. And it's really a convoluted story. It's going to need several episodes to get into that. The interesting thing about that one was that the last robbery, or last crime that they committed as a group was a robbery of the Domino's Pizza over in the Town and Country Shopping Center where Albertsons is. And they got caught, or somebody, squealed on them for that robbery and kind of unraveled their crime ring. And I just thought it was interesting that robbery of Domino's Pizza was the first domino that brought it down.
That's
good one.
That's a good one.
The Domino series.
Coming from a legal mind, I have to ask this question. So, are you careful about what you say, or do you try to stick to as much citable sources as you can, so that you're not maybe offering an opinion on something that may not be necessarily true and get yourself in hot water with some defamation or anything else?
I go basically by the newspaper accounts in the newspaper. I mean, I'm not going to. I mean,
you're not sitting there reading the clip, right? You're obviously adding your artistic and creative spin to it in your story,
right?
But I'm sure you're cautious of straying too far from the story.
Yeah, I'm working on a story now, and I'm trying to figure out how to tell it. In '84, a lady came up missing, and she was a mom of three teenagers, and she just went missing. And she had a boyfriend. Her boyfriend was a married man. And 8 months later, they found her car in a canal, and they ruled it an accident. Well, her family doesn't think it was an accident. They think it was murder, and they suspect certain people. Well, I want to tell that story. How am I going to tell that story without naming who they suspect? Yeah.
Sure.
So I'm gonna make up names, I think, for that story.
Yeah. Just try to maybe put them in context so you can separate who they are. Yeah, that's hard. I don't know how you tell a story without the context of who they are and what relationship they are to her. Yeah, that would be difficult.
Yeah.
So earlier, before we went on air here, I guess Jamie alluded to something. You do like special events, or what do you got going on?
I did a Halloween tour, and it was a self-guided audio tour, and you just listen to it in your car, and I told you what address to go to, and I told you what happened there.
Oh, wow.
And
it was fun.
I did that for the whole month of October.
She's smiling ear to ear.
It wasn't like morbid, but we didn't know really what we were going to get into. And you put it on in the car, and he says next address, and you have push pause till you get there, and then start it up once you're there. And it's just a story about a murder. Usually I'll write a murder that took place inside the house, but it was fascinating and fun, and good time.
There were a couple of creepy, scary stories that I told.
And so you're getting ready to do another?
I'm working on a Friday the 13th tour.
When is that? May?
May.
Yeah. Okay.
Or only Friday the 13th.
Is it? Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to do that in May, and then I'll do another Halloween tour in October.
So the same kind of layout where you give the address at like 4 or 5 homes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many different.
Yeah.
Like we're going all over the place.
There was another thing on the legal aspect of it. There was a story, Stranger Than Fiction. You remember that? The guy that was killed by his son. There were several juveniles involved in that crime. It was the whole damn family conspired to kill him, And it was actually the wife was the leader. But it's like, how do I tell that story with all these minors involved? And some of them, the one that did the killing, he did his time, and I think I named him. But the other ones that were kind of like had a role to play, but they didn't actually pull the trigger, I changed their names. And they're not hard to find. I mean, they're out there. I just didn't want to be responsible for naming their names.
Right.
And some of them look like they've moved on. I found them on Facebook. And
yeah, I mean, I don't know that. I mean, actually naming their names adds to the story much.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that it would change the story you're telling other than potentially cause you problems.
Yeah.
Seems like the downside's worse than the upside on that.
Exactly.
But what I wanted to go back to, and this is something that we're still working on. So we're on episode 130 now. This will be 132 ballpark. About 2 years ago, roughly, right? Actually, we had the bright idea to start it right before COVID hit. And we did, and we got 4 or 5, 8 episodes in, and then we had to start doing Zoom, and it just became a little more difficult, but we made through it. But you brought up an interesting point about the timing of it. And my thought process in doing this podcast was, we didn't want to set a set time that it has to be this or this. It just, as long as it's interesting and there's good content, something that valuable that people can derive from it, we're just going to keep going. And if it's an hour, it's an hour. If it's 30, it's 30. I like those long form podcasts where you can actually listen to someone talk for 2 hours or 3 hours, like Joe Rogan. Yeah. But you did some homework on it and that we haven't done. And you think that 15 and 20 minutes is a sweet spot, or is that just something maybe for focusing on Bakersfield and what you're trying to accomplish?
For me personally, focusing on Bakersfield and
could if it's 15 minutes, then we're done here.
We're done. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for coming in. Bye.
People do listen to podcasts doing other things. They're washing the dishes or cooking dinner or whatever,
But don't you find if it's engaging enough and interesting enough that you get to work and it's like, well, I can sit here for 10 minutes and finish it, or you purposely wanted to keep it for the smaller.
That drive time.
Yeah, just that drive time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess maybe the answer would be to what you were saying is do a series.
Yeah.
So you can delve into more content, but make them different episodes.
And that's the problem with podcasts or audio, is that you don't have the benefit of visuals. When you have somebody with a story with 5 or 6 characters, it's not like 48 Hours or what TV shows that you can remind people who these people were you were talking about. Pop their picture out. So
Jamie alluded to.
You do post pictures on Facebook and Instagram,
right,
which is a helpful tool and just kind of gives you, as the listener, the deeper dive opportunity to go look at those. And it makes the content come more alive. So I really appreciate that you do that.
Yeah. And I do that for each episode. Just Notorious Bakersfield on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter.
Website as well?
Yes, notoriousbakersfield.com.
Right.
But you also post in the Kern County of Old group. I think that's where I first found out about you, in that group. Yeah.
Each episode I post in that. I got kicked out of another group.
You violate some...
They just say no promotion, but...
Oh, okay.
It's hard not to, especially with what you're doing. It's like you want to get followers.
They post articles to newspapers and they post YouTube videos. So
has any story that you've covered so far, the 44 that you've done, hit you personally for one reason or another?
Not personally. The Park Stockdale horror, that was the most disturbing. I'd never heard of it before. It was a father that murdered his 2 kids in Park Stockdale. And I just can't happen to stumble on it. I was reading old court documents. I'm like, I'd never heard of this. And I mean, it kept me up that night after I read it. It was horrible. It was horrible.
How long ago was that one?
In the 70s, I think 73, 74. And he killed his son and daughter.
To get back at his wife,
yeah,
right?
His wife was leaving him. It was in, and I think I never heard of that. Well, I was a little kid then, like your parents didn't tell you about your grandparents. And so I'm like, why didn't I hear about this? But I talked to a lot of people that were around then, and they don't remember it.
Do you find that certain stories aren't remembered or talked about as much because of the people involved? Maybe if there's someone who has some connection or some prominence, or maybe that it tends to get buried quicker or not talked about as much.
It just falls out of the news. Just go on to the next news cycle.
Kind of like it happens now.
Yeah,
I mean, honestly.
Yeah. And as long as it, like that guy, I'm trying to think of his name, Daniel Fuzzelman, he appealed and got a new trial, and the trial moved to San Diego. So it was in the news for years and years and years. So yeah, but then once it's out of the news, it's out of the news. So that's kind of how I gauge a story. How notorious the story is how long it stayed in the newspaper.
Well, being Notorious Bakersfield, it's not all about crime. You do also stories like you did one on Truxton Beale. So I'm curious if you planned that, like this one's, these set are going to be about murder and then a historical one, or do you just
not
pick them based on your interest?
I try not to do too many true crime right in a row. I kind of break it up with a history one, but I'll tell you the true crime is more popular for the downloads. I did one on the earthquake, the 1952 earthquake. And I did one on Wiley and Grace Doris. Wiley was the defense attorney, and his wife, Grace. Wiley was going to run for assembly, and he went to the First World War, and his wife decided to run in his place, and she won. She was one of the first. There were 3 women elected that year. elected to the California Assembly. And Bakersfield voters sent a woman to the California Assembly in 1917. Pretty remarkable. And that's the frustrating thing, is there's not that much known about her. There's no books written about her. For somebody that was a
pioneer in state politics, right?
Yeah. And Wiley was a, if you got caught standing over a dead body that you just murdered, you wanted him as your defense attorney. He was that good. The chief of police got Wiley as a defense attorney when he was having his corruption problems. So
good to know. Well, that doesn't help me now, but
and that also makes me, Kyle being a lawyer, doing this podcast makes me respect the evolution of law. I've read old stories where they convicted a guy for murder. All he was doing was riding the dead guy's horse or wearing the dead guy's clothes. And that's the only evidence they had against him. And they hung him. So it makes me appreciate how far we've come. We have more rights now.
More protections. Yeah. That's an interesting observation, especially with like DNA, right? How that's changed things.
Oh, yeah.
Now studies are starting to come out and actually be talked about. We knew about this in law school, so that 20-something years ago it was talked about in law school. But the inherent unreliability of eyewitness testimony. But for a long time, I don't think that really was talked about in the public sphere as much as it is becoming pretty mainstream now. That I think if you talk to most people, they are aware. I don't know. I'll ask you guys. Would that something you guys would think is reliable eyewitness testimony? Just off the cuff, is that something you think that would be? Okay.
No, I wouldn't.
I think 10, 15 years ago, I think most people would.
Depends on if I'm the eyewitness or not.
Yeah, right.
So in law school, the professor did it. So it was a criminal law. And what they did is they were right in the middle of a lecture and they staged someone to come in and be disruptive and kind of cause a scene and a ruckus or whatever. And we're all, studying, taking notes and freaking out in law school. And this happens. And then everyone's kind of like, what's going on? And then the exercise was, okay, so now we're going to start talking, how would you describe him? I mean, it was like Hispanic, white, black, 5'2", 6'1", 140, 190. Yeah. And so the whole point of the exercise was like, this is what a lot of criminal cases rely on, is just strictly eyewitness testimony. And sometimes that's not the most reliable. Yeah. So that made me, like, oh, okay. Then I started doing parole advocacy work for, Barry Scheck. He did the Innocence Project, where you started using DNA to overturn sentences for people wrongfully convicted of crimes. And so I did that as an internship for a little bit, and I was just blown away and fascinated. Kind of what you were saying about how things have evolved and the way we prosecute. It's not as clean as you think.
Yeah. And also, as frustrating as, we hear about these lenient sentences and everything. In the 70s, I covered 3 murders back in February, and love gone wrong is what I... And anyways, the 3 people responsible for those murders, none of them served more than 4 or 5 years. And it's like, they were guilty of second-degree murder, or, whatever it was at the time. So,
and your story about Jody, who was abandoned on the freeway, and her stepfather was convicted, sent to death row, and you didn't really go into it, but his case, he was able to appeal and get a new case and was out in like 5 years after that.
For the murder of their brother? Okay.
And abandonment of her.
Okay. I thought it was just the abandonment. I was like, oh, you got a death sentence for abandonment. I was like, that.
No, he murdered a little kid.
Right.
And somehow he got a new trial. And I think he was able to plea bargain down to second-degree murder or something, and that he was already in jail for, whatever the sentence was going to be. And
basically got like credit time served at that point.
Yeah. So those kinds of things are frustrating, but,
Do you find that you like to report on stories that do have an ending? I have a friend, we watch Dateline every week, and he's like, I like Dateline because there's typically an ending. Yeah. Somebody went to jail, right?
Yeah.
But where some of these other podcasts is like, it's just a mystery and it ends open-ended without that person being held accountable. So does that factor into how you choose your stories?
Not necessarily. It just depends on if it's an interesting story or not.
So there's still some unsolved mysteries that you've covered.
Yeah.
Any interest in it diving deep into that, or is that a rabbit hole you don't want to go down?
You mean like looking at an unsolved murder or something? I don't know. I think there is where you're looking at a lot of liability.
Yeah, but there's people out there that are doing that. There's a ton of podcasts that are out there trying to actually dig up cold cases and bringing light to them and re-interviewing people. And,
Oh, that I don't have a problem with. Yeah.
No, I don't mean like accusing, like making accusations. Like you've heard it here on Notorious Bakersfield. This is the guy that did it. Yeah, I probably wouldn't advise that. But just bring up those cases and re-interviewing people, and then I've listened to, I can't think of the name of the podcast or what episode, but there's been a few where that was the format. And then doing that, like they get a call like a year later saying, "Oh, I listened to your podcast and I heard your story, and I was actually one of the," and then they give them some, and then it leads to actually people being apprehended or crimes being solved or just,
that one over on the coast, the college student, I'm trying to think of the name.
Kristen Smart.
Yeah. Smart. Yeah. Yeah. They made an arrest directly result from that podcast. So that guy really dug deep into it.
Yes.
Yeah. And did they arrest her student and the father?
I think so. Or the stepfather or whatever it was. Yeah.
Yep.
That would be a good. I mean, I don't know how you can do that in 15 or 20 minutes. I mean, that was 27 years in the making of, I think it was 1995.
Yeah.
95? Was that when she went
around
missing?
then?
Yeah.
In the 90s.
Yeah. I think it was, see, I graduated high school in 95 and I was either at Santa Barbara or it was 95 or 96, pretty close to that, but you could do a 10-part series on that.
And there's stories in Bakersfield where it does, like the Bill Stephanie murder in the 80s, that deserves because it's so complicated. And another story is the Lords of Bakersfield.
Just gonna ask that. That was on my list of one of the things. Have you crossed that yet? Crossed that bridge?
Not yet.
Okay.
A friend of mine is doing a podcast on it, and I'm kind of waiting to see how she does it. We're going to do it totally different, but she's working on it, and I think it'll be out this summer on Lords of Bakersfield. So we'll see.
There's been several that have kind of looked into that. I know there was a writer that wrote, I believe he wrote a book on it.
I think Bob Price did a lot on it.
Yeah.
Too,
Nick Ballardis. I think he used to be the Californian. I know he had a lot of interest in that at one point.
He wrote, I'm trying to think of the name of the book. But he did the other one, Mean Justice, that looked into the Dunn murder. But yeah, Bob Price is responsible for kind of connecting all of those murders together, bringing it to light. I don't necessarily think all of them are connected. They just happen to be. I don't think a murder that happened in the 80s is connected to a murder that happened in the 2000s with Steve Towser. So
they tried to link it though.
Yeah.
Wasn't part of it, I honestly, I didn't know too much about it, admittedly, but wasn't part of the story having to do with like a pedophile ring or some sort of...
It was powerful gay men in Bakersfield.
So it wasn't pedophile. Okay.
Not necessarily. Well, I mean, it depends on
I guess the age of
the age. Yeah. The Robert Mistrial who was convicted of, oh gosh, what was the guy's name? But anyways, he just got out of prison. He was 14 years old when these men were taking advantage of him. So yeah, I mean, I guess pedophile. Yeah.
And so he murdered the perpetrator of the crime and then and was sentenced to...
Ed Buck is who he was. I don't know if he was involved in Ed Buck's murder, and the other guy, both of them have been out. The other kid, I think he was 18 when he was convicted, but yeah, Ed Buck took advantage of Robert Mistrial when he was like 13, 14 years old.
I wonder if he would be someone that would be allowed to let you interview him. I don't know if you reached out or if your friend has reached out to them.
Yeah, I've talked to his husband, yeah.
Okay. So maybe.
Okay,
I'm intrigued now. I'm going to quit this pod. Our 2 cents is over. I'm going to join the Notorious Bakersfield.
Yeah, you need a co-host.
This is so much more interesting.
My friend that's doing the podcast on that she interviewed the other guy. Kamanish was his name, and he's out of prison. And I said, aren't you creeped out? I mean, he like killed Ed Buck with a shovel, you know. And I'm like, would you ever go into like meet him? You know, would you ever like go to his apartment to interview him? She's like, So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that was pretty targeted victim, right?
Yeah.
I don't think he was, that's not someone who's just randomly going out and...
Except if you know the story, Kamanish really didn't have any connection to Ed Buck. Robert Mistrial asked Kamanish to kill him for him. And Kamanish was like, okay, sounds like a good idea.
Oh, okay. So he was not taken advantage of in the same way that, okay.
No. That's why I just don't understand what the motive was for Kamanish to I mean, I'd have to have a good motive.
Were they friends?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And they went and killed him and brought his body back to his house, and they stole like a TV and microwave and then burned his house down.
I know it's hard to put yourself in like an 18-year-old's shoes. I mean, your mind is not fully developed yet. You know, no matter what. And I know you can vote at 18 and go to war, but I know you're not fully. You know,
I don't quite understand what the motive was behind that on his part. I can see Robert Kamenisch's part or Robert Mistrial's part,
right?
But
if that's your friend and he's been telling you all these horrible things that this old guy's been doing to him or doing, and maybe you're just like, all right, well,
but he didn't seem. I don't know.
I don't know. That's I'm just.
But they're both out of prison. It's been 30 years and they're both out of prison. That's why I don't know if I could. Somebody that did that, I don't know if I could sit down and like this
and interview him.
Yeah.
That'd definitely be strange.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about what your plan is. We talked before, we went on air, but you got an idea of you like to pull together some local podcasters.
I would.
Talk about that.
Did I talk to you about it?
No.
Here when we were talking about it?
I don't think so.
No.
I would like to get a group of independent podcasters, they're not part of a radio station or anything, and just kind of sit around and talk about our podcasts and introduce them to our audiences, and then maybe like play a 1 or 2 minute clip of the of our podcast, most recent episode or an episode you want to highlight, and then each podcaster go back and upload it as an episode of your podcast. We see like Wondery or podcast networks do that for their promoting podcasts.
Right.
And I think independent podcasters in Bakersfield would help promote it, because there's listeners of mine that may be interested in our 2 cents that aren't aware of it.
Right. That's interesting. Have you talked to the guys that do Sofa King yet?
Not yet.
Okay. They do Podbelly. Have you heard about what they're doing with that? It's like a consortium of podcasts that they have on their network. That they bundle up, like, I don't want to speak out of turn if I'm saying it incorrectly, but I think the concept was they take, not just in Bakersfield, but all over the country, a bunch of podcasts and put it together in a bundle, and based on the aggregate number of downloads, it helps them sell advertising space for.
I see. Yeah.
So it's a way of like adding up downloads to pitch to one company who would say, I'm not going to invest on this guy's show because he only has 1,000 downloads, but if you add these 9 up, they have 20,000, and that's a market I'm cool with.
It's kind of like building a network.
Yeah,
Network.
Yeah, exactly. I think they call it Podbelly, but they have a huge following, the Sofa King podcast here in town.
They do,
and I don't know that even a large portion of it's even Bakersfield listeners. I mean, they got from all over the world. I mean, Germany, and because we had him on and interviewed him, one of the guys, and I can't think of his name right now, but he was saying that significantly more than half of the stuff they get, like the fan mail and the requests or the gifts that they get for the little studio that they have, is from other than Bakersfield, out of state, out of country, so on and so forth.
So you're looking at doing something that kind of pulls the local community of podcasters together and gets us all exposure.
Promote it, promote local. Yeah. Independent and non-religious.
Okay.
Every church in town has a podcast,
right?
So.
And there's a lot of people who are doing podcasts who are tied to maybe like iHeartRadio or bigger audience that outside of Bakersfield. I think that's a great idea. We should talk to the team, but I would love to do something like that.
Yeah.
Keep us posted on that, and obviously anybody that follows you on Facebook, keep us all informed of that.
I've asked a couple of them if they'd be interested. Richard Bean, Bakersfield Observed.
He would be a good one.
And Simplast Podcast, they do a podcast here. I think they do like once a month. So.
Yeah, I know there's an ag one. Tech Ag does that one. Morgan Houchin and John Moore.
And the Small Business Celebration.
Small Business Celebration, He's pretty much focused on the YouTube channel, but he also airs as a podcast. So
yeah, there's a lot of podcasts. I'm sure podcasts I'm not aware of. Because I'm just doing mine out of my walk-in closet at home.
I was gonna ask that question. What your studio setup looks like, or how you do it?
This is first class where we are now.
So how do you set up a time? Like, do you treat it as like, okay, I'm going to do 5 hours of research this week or this day, for example, and then I'm going to record on this day, or is it just kind of?
Yeah, I try to record on Sunday night.
Okay.
Because that's the quietest night in my neighborhood.
Okay. Okay.
And record on Sunday night and then edit Monday and then upload Monday night.
And then releases Tuesday or Monday night, but Tuesday probably most people see it. Or maybe you might be up at 12:01 waiting for the next episode to drop.
What is the typical production for you from research all the way to that upload date? Is that a week or longer?
It depends, because I'm researching stories all the time. Like
How many are you researching currently?
like 5 at a time.
5 at a time. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so you'll put one down, pick up on another, and then
whichever one I have pretty much done.
that's the next in queue.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you do any like teasers as to what's coming up, or do you?
Occasionally.
Okay.
Depends on how far along I am.
Right.
And it's usually getting down to the wire. I'm like,
You don't want to tease something and not have it come out for 6 months. That kind of defeats the purpose.
Oh, the last one was last one before this last one was the judge and the stripper.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Some people remembered her name, the stripper's name.
Well, that was back in the 80s or something?
It was in the 90s. Yeah.
90s? Yeah, I think I remember that.
Judge Klein.
I don't know that story. I haven't listened. What?
Use your imagination.
Well, I mean,
He was a municipal court judge, which they don't have anymore, right?
Right.
Yeah. And this stripper had gotten arrested for indecent exposure, and she went to her preliminary hearing, and he met her out in the hallway and asked her some questions about her case, and kind of inappropriate for a judge without her attorney, and then got her number, and he called her and said, "Hey, come down to the courthouse on Sunday." And she came down, and he asked her to do a show for him. Then her next hearing date was like the next day, and her attorney's like, "What? What happened?"
wait a second. So was this a quid pro quo, as in like, you do this, your case goes away?
He was
or you do this and like
he was
a side job.
He was charged with soliciting a bribe. Her defense was, or she said, that she never did a private dance without security. So his attorneys at Echeverry, and they hired a private investigator who went to Deja Vu, got to know her, and hired her to do a dance down in Beverly Hills. And she went down and did the dance. And when she went to testify during the trial, they said, "Now you never, do these private dances without security?" And she said, "No, never." Ta-da! Here's the video.
Beverly Hills without a security guard.
and he was acquitted.
So they just didn't believe her testimony that
Yeah, he was acquitted, but then he had to resign as a judge, and
so the bar,
he's still practicing law.
but the California bar probably wasn't
the judicial.
too kind on.
I don't know.
Okay.
He may have had
Have
to
to
pay a
look that
fine or
up.
something.
I got some research to do. Taking some notes here.
Interesting. All right. Well, here, you got any more questions there?
Oh, I have a lot. So you can go ahead. You're the
No,
host.
keep going.
No, go
Yeah.
ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm wondering if you have a favorite era that you research, because you started in like the 1800s with the two ferries, right?
That was
1800s.
1927.
Oh,
Yeah.
so you've done them all throughout, at
Yeah.
least, from 1900 to
I don't
date.
necessarily have a favorite. I just like before the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, where you can't just search it on your own.
Right.
Yeah.
Come up with tons of information. It's like, he digs deep.
Occasionally, though, like if somebody appeals something, they'll have the California Supreme Court ruling online, and that's interesting. So that's how I found the Fuzzleman, the guy that killed his two kids. That's how I found the story. It wasn't through the newspapers.
Yeah.
Why do you think? And I'm gonna. I'm not picking on you on this one at all.
It's okay.
But
Women
yes,
are into it.
I'm gonna ask. Do you have a breakdown of your downloads by sex?
I don't. By
Okay.
gender, I don't.
Yeah. Okay. I would be willing to bet it would be significantly heavy towards the female side, just from my personal experience of my wife and her friends who can't get enough of like murder and it's like, what is it about females that just can't get enough of this topic?
I don't know.
Am I off based on
No,
that, or do you
you're
think that's
not.
accurate? Okay.
I think it's accurate.
Okay.
And I don't know what it's about.
But you love it. I mean, it
I
seems like you're
do.
so engaged in
Yes.
it. And it's interesting. Don't get me wrong. I'm not interested, but I've noticed the interest definitely sways towards the fairer sex.
I can't explain it, but I love it. Keep them coming.
What is interesting is that about half of my downloads are from outside of Bakersfield.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Bakersfield's half of the downloads. Los Angeles is the next, and then I think like Fresno, then so
Okay.
other valley towns.
Any big showing in like Illinois or Florida or some random place that hasn't
No,
happened to catch on yet?
Yeah, there was, but I think it was a glitch in the podcasting hosts
Okay.
stats somewhere in Ohio. it was a glitch. So.
See, our podcast is different. We're definitely catering towards the community, right? Or Bakersfield or Kern County at large. And so we, the guests we have are people involved in the community, business leaders, nonprofits, entrepreneurs, so on and so forth. I've noticed on some months we've had not a large number, but more than a blip of like in Michigan, for example. We had like maybe 100 downloads or 90 downloads, which it's not a ton, but it's like, well, who's listened about Dave Plievelich's journey as an entrepreneur in Michigan? Not that you're not interesting, but but your episode, if that were to schedule somewhere when we're recording right now, that would be interesting to a lot of people outside of Bakersfield.
They don't care where it happens.
I mean, you have to be from Bakersfield. You happen to be talking about Bakersfield. But it's interesting content that's outside.
I think it attracts a lot of people who have a connection to Bakersfield somehow. They've lived here, their kids lived here, or, that's who I think is most of the audience.
Yeah.
But most of them, half of them don't currently live in Bakersfield. So,
and I think even people in LA, I mean, I know Fresno, but even I think LA in particular, like they have an opinion of Bakersfield. And so, I mean, it's like, it's just, we have an opinion of LA, I'm sure. So I think for them, it's probably just because of the close proximity, geographically, 90 miles down the 5. It's like, that's all that stuff that's going on in that town. I could see that is as to why. Yeah. Maybe not.
I think it's people that have a connection to Bakersfield.
Like actual friends and family.
Or used to live here. Because I wouldn't be too interested in a true crime or podcast that talked about Santa Barbara or, or Sacramento or, I don't think I would. But I recognize some, people recognize the street names when I talk about them and, so.
And maybe some of the locations, right? Yeah, I could see that. But when it's an interesting story, it's an interesting story. Exactly. I guess it doesn't matter where it's at.
Exactly.
It doesn't necessarily paint Bakersfield in the best light since a lot of it is about crime and murder, but I'm curious if you have like top 3 episodes that you would recommend to someone who's maybe new to your podcast or doesn't live in Bakersfield.
Good question.
The Two Fairies, the very first episode I did, the mother and daughter that were murdered. That was in 1927, I believe, 26. That's one of my favorites. Rampage in Rosedale.
I remember that.
Do you?
I lived on Palm.
Did you really?
Mm-hmm.
And then, what's the next one? Probably Abandoned on the Freeway, and then Jody's interview.
Yeah, it is. Those 3 are really good.
What's your 3? If you were to recommend new listeners to listen to his podcast, what would it be?
I would pick the Rampage in Rosedale also.
What is that one? I'm not familiar with that one.
You can tell it better than me.
Robert Courtney was a slumlord, and he got a violation at one of his rental properties on South Union. The health inspector was Cynthia Volpe, and she wrote him the violation, and he started beating her on the side of Union Avenue, just dislocated her jaw, broke her nose, and he got arrested and was out on bail and had gone to trial. It was like a year later after that. And Cynthia Volpe sued him. And that was in the court system, I think, the suit.
A civil suit.
Right.
Seeking monetary damage.
Yeah. And during his criminal trial, the jury was out for deliberations. And that morning that they were going to reconvene, he came to the Volpe house on Palm Avenue. And he killed Cynthia's dad, Cynthia's mom, who traveled here from Arizona, and Cynthia Volpe in her house, and killed all 3 of them. And her 2 kids were there in the house with them. And then he went on the run. It was about 24 hours, and they chased him. They found him. They located him in Lamont at the fast trip in Lamont, if you know Lamont, and chased him up 58. And he started going toward Tehachapi, and he turned around and started coming back toward Bakersfield. And they kind of parked his car in the middle of in the center median, and he committed suicide, and his car exploded. But the interesting thing, do you remember that, Kyle?
I don't.
Wow, I don't recall at all.
What year was that?
92?
Yeah.
So I would have been, 92. I'd have been like a freshman in high school, sophomore in high school. So probably old enough to remember it.
It was on the news. The interesting story about that is people are traveling on 58, and they stopped traffic on 58 because of what was going on down in Bakersfield. So this guy that was traveling down 58 on his way to Bakersfield got stopped in Tehachapi and stopped in a convenience store and like, what's going on? And he was from Anchorage, Alaska. And they said, they're having a shootout with this guy that killed a family. And he said, oh, really? And so they showed him the newspaper, and he started reading it. And he's like, Robert Courtney, that name is familiar. And it dawned on him. He's like, that guy killed his mom and brother and sister when he was 13 years old up in Anchorage, Alaska.
Whoa.
No.
Yeah.
It went through a juvenile system and got out, and
Evidently, not
obviously got out.
Not a lot is known. Not a lot is known about him. What kind of punishment he had? But it was like before Alaska was a state. It was like a year before it was a state, so they didn't even know how to deal with a 13-year-old.
Was that part of your podcast? Was
Yeah.
that, okay.
Rampage in Rosedale.
Okay, I'm going to listen to that
That's a good
full episode. Now. My in-laws live on Palm, and they were definitely living there at that time. What Palm and what was the intersection? Or
Like Jewetta. It was just east of Jewetta.
Okay. Okay. So just down the street. So they probably remember that story.
Possibly.
I mentioned them tonight.
It was a big.
I think that's the one that sticks out for me is I lived on Palm, or I grew up on Palm, and my parents' friends lived in the house Robert Courtney lived before he lived there. And it was just down the street from the Volpes. So,
He lived on Newt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same neighborhood. So it was like happening in our neighborhood.
He actually lived in the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's a law that came out after that about what somebody could find out about somebody else. I don't quite understand it, but it's like it probably wouldn't have done any good in that case because he lived right around the corner. He probably saw him.
What did it have to do with health officials, like who the citing official or officer is, maybe to not disclose the name and just maybe say it's from the agency? Or did that
personal information about somebody suing somebody else?
Oh, interesting.
I remember back it was in the 90s, I was a victim of a crime. And I remember they were able to get my information from the police report.
And were you a minor at the time or were you an adult? Oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
And they sent me letters in my house. Yeah,
the defendant or the, really?
It was really creepy.
So that was public record and they accessed it? And
yeah. They could get a copy of the police report and my information was in that.
Not redacted.
Not redacted. And I think
that should have been redacted.
That doesn't make sense. Well, maybe that wasn't the law at the time. I don't know.
I don't think it was.
Yeah.
It was really creepy.
If it was, you had a good case, a civil case on your hand.
They've changed it now. And it didn't even have to do with anything personally. It was something that happened to me at work.
Oh, okay.
And we caught a shoplifter.
Where was that?
I worked at Albertsons.
Okay. Because you mentioned the fast strip in Lamont. So my only brush with a potential crime, a story I'm going to share, it's not a whole podcast worthy, but the fast strip on White Lane in Gosford, it's got entrances on both sides, right? You have the dual gas stations on both sides and front door. So I was like 17, 18. I'm filling up my little Camry, getting gas. And while I'm in there's an armed robbery going on in the store that I'm just oblivious to because I'm out pumping gas. And it just so happened when I was finished pumping gas and was actually going to pay for it, I walked in the door while the assailant was bolting out the other door. Still had no idea what was going on. I'm walking up to the cashier. She's crying. Everyone's freaking out. I'm like, what's going on? And then,
I just want to pay.
And then they told me in the story, and actually they showed me I watched the video surveillance, and I see my little 16-year-old skinny self walking in as this guy's like bailing out the other door. I was like, okay, that's good timing. Someone was on my side at that point. So
I learned so much about you, Kyle. Good Lord.
I don't even know you anymore.
I don't. I gotta get a bottle of wine and go sit and just chat for a little bit. I'll interview you next time. I got questions. Good Lord, I got questions.
Let's get some rapid fires going.
All right, so this is our rapid fire questions. So it's off topic, and what's the best advice you've ever received?
Don't sweat the small stuff.
Don't sweat the small stuff. Good one.
I'll take number 2. You want to take the last one, Jim?
Sure.
Okay. If you won $10 million tomorrow, what would you spend it on?
I wouldn't keep it for myself. I would do philanthropic things with it. I mean, I would live comfortably, of course.
You wouldn't blow it on a $10,000 Rolex or a $100,000 diamond necklace?
No.
It would kind of fit you. So we don't have YouTube in here, but he's got this Notorious Bakersfield Podcast sweater on that I could see like a heavy chain going on right now. That
blinged out.
Yeah, it would look good.
No, I'm not big into jewelry.
I'm joking.
Okay, third question. What is a common myth about your job or field of expertise?
The podcast, probably that it's easy, and it's not. I mean, there's a lot of research that goes into it.
I got one more just out of curiosity, because it always blows my mind when it comes to music choices. Like if you look at Kyle Jones, you would never, ever guess
gangster rap,
hardcore Metallica, man. Yeah. Hardcore.
Wow.
Yeah, what's your little secret music that people be like, no way?
I don't really have a favorite. I don't like metal.
It's all right.
I mean, it's okay. Some of it's okay. My favorite artist is Cyndi Lauper. She's the one I've seen in concert the most. And so if there's a Cyndi Lauper concert, I'll probably go to it within 100, 200 miles.
Wow.
I would not have guessed
I would so that counts as a surprise.
Yeah. See? All right.
She was popular when I was just, when I was in high school, and she was the Kern County Fair. And my sister and I went to the concert at the fair, and we were up in the front, and there were no seating. There was like gang seating behind us. I was standing up on a hay bale, at the Kern County Fair, watching her, and a fat lady sat on my foot, and I couldn't move the whole concert.
A little too shy to go. Excuse me. All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us today. If you don't mind, tell us one more time how our listeners can find you.
I'm on all the podcast apps, Apple, Google, Spotify. You can also listen to it at notoriousbakersfield.com.
Awesome. Well, from bottom of my heart, thank you for making my first hosting gig here a good one.
You did a great job.
Yeah,
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Well, again, thanks for having you, and we look forward to hearing more about what you got going on down the road, especially the podcast community thing. So,
absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, take care.
See you guys.
This show has been brought to you by the Law Office of Kyle Jones, Troy Burton with the Lynn Company, CPA John Duffield, Scott Hansen Real Estate Lender, broker and investor, and Dave Plivelich, President and CEO of the Marcom Group and MarcomBranding.com. You've been listening to the Our 2 Cents Podcast. Check out the show notes for links and more information about the show. Also visit our website at our2centspodcast.com or catch us on Instagram at Our 2 Cents Podcasts. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share with others.